there's a potential that such a committee will favor a particular regime, because these are the people who will also fund the party in elections and so on and so forth. What should we be looking at in this discussion? This, which I say is a discussion or a policy we should have had many decades ago and not today.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm following the conversation keenly. I mean, first off, for me, I don't support a ban. I think it actually would defeat the purpose or the intent of that policy. I think that there are better tools that one can actually use if you want to support your local industry to meet that demand.
So like I corrected Ricketts Hagan, it's restriction, not a ban, so that the ministers' committee will determine who gets license, permits to bring in how many of those products.
Yeah, but in essence, the restriction is still going to work out as though it was a ban. So, I mean, it's a question of semantics. But
yeah, it's correct to an extent, because if you went ahead without the permit, you could go to jail for 1 year, you pay fines of so much.
Yeah. And then, I mean, the committee itself, the composition and all of that, for me, is problematic, right? We have had instances in our own industrial and economic history. You can go back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, where we've attempted things like this in the past. And what actually ended up happening was having more corruption, as others have said, more rent-seeking, and people ultimately lining their pockets, which ends up defeating the purpose of the policy. So we need to go back. Again, the policy or this restriction, if you attempt to go by that, even some of the protocols that we've signed, with the WTO, even the IMF and all of that, it could possibly contravene some of those, international conditions and protocols that we've signed up to. The fundamental thing or the root cause is, why is it that our local companies are not able to produce to meet that demand? And that's where I think we've got to, again, address our minds to. So if you put in a restriction or a ban and you don't address the supply side constraint and all of that, you actually end up driving more inflation. It's actually going to be inflationary because people still want those things, and it ends up defeating the whole purpose. So let me take you quickly to paragraph 395 of the 2024 budget. And this is where the government talks about its medium-term growth strategy and what it wants to do to sort of reverse some of these things. It says that the growth strategy seeks to support the implementation of interventions that, one, increase our capacity to produce, deepen value chain arrangements, facilitate and modernize storage, and increase the shelf life of jobs, and then it leads to job, food security and resilience, etc. But I just want to highlight one of the first points there, which is really a question of how do you increase the capacity to produce? You get my point? To the point that it is, one, competitive, and you are able to then meet a part of that demand. You were giving the example of poultry. There's a table in the budget, again, table 29, which shows the priority commodities and targets that the government has for this. If you take poultry, the statistic that you've got in there, I think is the first line in that table, we are only meeting 5% of the national demand, right? So in other words, 95% is still coming in by way of imports. And by 2023, 2024, the expectation is that you move this thing up to about 20% of the demand. So if you even impose a restriction and your local people are still, according to the government's own projections, only going to do about 20% of the demand, then where is that extra 80 going to come from? You are still going to end up actually causing a much worse or deeper problem than you're trying to correct. The same thing with tomato. You can see again in that table. In tomato 2022, the national demand was about 1.3 million tons. Local production is 468,000, right? Tons. So again, you are meeting only about 40% of that market. So if you try to impose these restrictions, while you don't fundamentally address the issue of the capacity to produce, that many of our firms are not able to compete. One, the dumping factor is there, but also you have internal factors that are constraining them. So you've got issue of killer taxes, you've got issue of high cost. They go to the bank, they have to borrow, and you're talking 35% plus interest rates. Whereas the person in Europe or some other place is getting this from the bank at 2%, 5%, even 10%. There's no way that your local industry will be able to compete on that basis. So what I think that we've got to do for me is to go back and perhaps if you even want to restrict it, you have to face it over a certain period. Number two, we have to address the issue of this local capacity and then the availability of substitutes, right, for people to change or to have from one form or the other. If you take poultry is like the cheapest protein for many households in Ghana. It's become almost like core to their livelihoods and all of that. So you impose a restriction, the local market cannot meet it because even by your own estimates, they're only going to be able to do about 25% of that.
Right.
You end up having to drive up inflation. Look at the inflation basket. A bigger chunk of it is coming by way of food inflation. And that, again, is something that, in my view, we cannot address this policy with it in a rather sort of...
There's an economist who suggests that we could, to avoid the dumping situation that we have raised also, and how, because dumping means these goods are so cheap and we all run to them instead of the local produce, the government can impose heavy taxes on these imports and use the revenue directly to support local producers.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the trade policy tools that is available under even, the WTO protocols that often you use tax policy tools so you can hike up or increase the tariffs at the ports, or you can even use other what we call non-trade barriers. And the Europeans actually use this a lot against us if you want to even export things like mangoes and things where they say your banana or mango is not a particular size, it's not this and it's not that, and therefore you cannot bring it into the market. So he's very right on that. But that is only, in my view, a temporary measure. The more sustainable medium to long-term measure comes back to what you have to do to increase the local capacity to produce. So if your poultry farmers cannot get feed, if your poultry farmers don't have substitute for maize or the bran, and they still have to, again, spend millions of dollars or cedis to still import these things in, and they have to pay extraordinarily high cost on those things, then it doesn't matter the restrictions that you impose. You're still going to have an issue where it's actually going to end up, again, driving inflation. And my worry is the committee, just a quick one to land. On the committee, we've seen this in the past. There's a potential for catalyzation, there's a potential for monopolies to be created, and this ultimately creates more inefficiencies, and we end up being the worst for it as a country. So the policy needs a real...
Let me go to